Hi, and welcome to a special Santa Barbara Authors edition of Newsmakers TV. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Monday, January 16th, a national holiday as we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King and his legacy. And as we recall Dr. King confronting racism, hate, and violence, it seems an appropriate day to welcome back Jana Zimmer to the program for a conversation about her memoir, a new memoir just out this week, titled Chocolates from Tangier, a Holocaust replacement child's memoir of art and transformation. You don't get the Post-its with my notes on it. That's it. Jana's a writer, visual artist, longtime environmental warrior, and sometime land use attorney. And before we get into the questions, I just want to note she'll be speaking about and signing copies of the book at Chaucer's on Thursday at 6 p.m. Jana, thanks for taking the time to visit and give us a preview. You were last on the program in 2018 when we talked about your previous book, Navigating the California Coastal Act, and I can't imagine two books that are more different. This is a very extremely personal and emotionally compelling memoir that works on multiple layers. It's a first-person story. It's a story of your parents, both Holocaust survivors, as well as a platform for your visual art. And there are color reproductions of some of your pieces from your exhibitions, one in 2007 in Prague, your birthplace, and the other in Germany on the 70th anniversary of the death camps. So you write early in the book, the one immutable truth is that the losses of the Holocaust are the direct and immediate backdrop of your existence. For those who may not know you, talk first about the amazing story of your family and your upbringing, which are at the core of the words and the images of the book.
Okay, both my parents were Czech Jews. At the time that Hitler came into Prague, my father was living in Prague, working in Prague with his first wife and his daughter, Rita. My mother came from Moravia, and she was living in a smallish city called Kroměříž on the Morava River. It's in the central part of the Czech Republic, with her first husband. She had just gotten married. Alfred was the love of her life, or I should say the first love of her life. They had known each other since she was 17, and they had waited until she was 29 to get married because he was in training as a pediatrician, and they deferred their wedding. And they literally had just finished building and furnishing their first home together when Hitler came in. So each of them and their respective families were deported. My father to Terezín, all the Czech Jews went to Terezín, Theresienstadt, which is a ghetto town. It was originally a barracks that was built, I think, by Franz Josef, the emperor, in the 19th century. And it was converted to a concentration camp by the Germans in 1941. So most of the Czech Jews went there initially. They were deported from various towns and villages. And then they were there and basically waited to be put on a transport to the death camps. And in some instances that happened fairly quickly. And in others, like in the case of my mother was deported to Auschwitz from Terezín in 1944, in the fall of 1944. My father in June of 1944.
So then, they didn't meet till after the war was over.
They met after the war. They met on my mother's birthday in 1945, October. And she was sort of a blind date. They both had friends. That those first few months after the war were very confusing. People came back, looked for family, didn't find family. In my father's case, his wife and daughter had been deported to Auschwitz after he was and died there. So they mostly were making their way with their survivor friends. And my father's best friend from the camps. They were on the death march from Auschwitz to Gleiwitz together. Had reestablished himself in Prague, and he was dating a woman, also a survivor, and they had invited my father along, and my mother became his blind date.
And how soon after that were you born? You were born in Prague, correct?
I was born in Prague in November of 46.
Yeah. And then soon after that, you had to flee the communists, or you
Yes.
did flee the communists.
Yes, we did.
And went to Montreal.
The communists took over in February of 48. My father spent some months acquiring visas. So we left in actually in October. They had a lovely interlude in Paris for 6 weeks waiting for the boat to leave. I had my second birthday on the boat. It was the good ship Samaria, which is an ironic name. And we arrived in Halifax and got on a train to Montreal.
Now, you early in the book, you say, actually, it's the opening sentence. The sages speak about each child coming into the world to mend something in their family line and ultimately in the human family. In essence, our lives are meant to be acts of what we Jews called teshuvah, of turning toward a deeper and deeper level of healing. Talk a little bit about your motivation for doing the book. Why did you write it? And obviously do the art for it.
Well, as you know, the art, some of the art goes back 25 years to when I first started making art. My mother came to live with us here in Santa Barbara in 1995. And that's when I first started to make art. She brought with her this treasure trove of family documents, that some of them from the war, some of them go back to 1829. And so as she lived with me, and she would start to show me things and tell me things, and I was making the art as a way of communicating with her initially. This whole topic has been a very long process of me finding a voice, finding my voice, because I was forbidden from talking about it for so many years by my father and my mother on his behalf. So in 2006, 6 years after my mother died, I decided to take these documents back to Prague, and I donated them all to the Jewish Museum. And when I went there, I brought some of my own artwork, and the museum invited me to exhibit in Prague, as well as the Terezin Ghetto Museum invited me to exhibit there as well in September of 2007. So that was sort of the first phase of putting all of this together. Then I did other things in my art. I traveled a lot. It seems like every place I traveled, I was brought back to the story of the wandering Jew. In 2015, in the meantime, I had developed a relationship with a German high school teacher in Freiburg. And Freiburg was the town in Saxony where my mother had been a slave laborer in an airplane factory from October of 44 to April of 45. And Michael was this wonderful man, a true Christian, who made it his business to make sure that the people in his town acknowledged and remembered what happened during the war, because a lot of them pretended it didn't happen. And he eventually invited me, as well as Helga Hoskova, who was a Czech artist, a Jewish woman who had been a prisoner in Terezin along at the same time as my mother, and actually was along to Freiburg as a 14-year-old. I don't know that she was made to work in the factory, but she was with her mother. So she was an artist. She was one of the child artists in Terezin, and then pursued art throughout her life. She's still alive. She's now in her mid-90s. So the invitation was to me, to Helga, and to a young German artist named Stephanie Busch to put together an exhibition in Freiburg. In 2015, we went over, and that was that exhibition. I started writing Sorry?
Go ahead, finish your
Well, you
thought.
were asking why and how.
Yeah,
So I've sort of journaled more or less all my life, all my adult life, not regularly. And I got seriously into writing in about 2018 with Maureen Murdoch, who's a memoir writing teacher here in town. So as part of that writing group, I started to write more and more about the past. And I think, I can't remember exactly when or why I decided, oh, this should be a book. I should put this all together. But it had to do with COVID. It had to do
yeah,
with,
you told me it was during the pandemic that
yeah,
you
yeah.
had to be
So
productive.
I feel like COVID was very, very good. Cut that. Okay.
Let me back up to some of the things you were talking about in your childhood, and
Mhm.
I mean that I think your I would say courage, in how you write so personally and deeply about it. You say, looking out into the world as a child, I saw not a field of possibilities, but a vast emptiness, and there was always silence. There were no answers to my questions, not about where babies came from or why everyone else had a grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousins, and I did not. I was taught to not want anything as I observed my parents not wanting. Now, in some ways, you had a privileged childhood. You were an only child, ballet, piano, orthodontist, egg rolls, which everyone will want to look for the egg roll anecdote. But you mentioned your half sister, who died in the camps. Rita, I think is
Rita.
name, was your father's only child, and you said his loss hung like a veil over my natural exuberance. Talk about that's a big theme in the book. I think is her presence, her art. Finding out about her. Um, Talk about her a little bit.
Well, Rita was born in 1932 to my father and his first wife. So when the Germans came, she was just 7. They were deported together to Terezin. My father, through some machinations, managed to arrange for her to live with him and his wife together rather than in a separate children's barracks. And Rita was one of the child artists in Terezin. The artist who created the program for children's art there was a woman named Friedel Dicker Brandeis. And she was really a miracle worker. Instead of bringing the things that she was allowed to bring, personal possessions to the camp, she brought only art supplies because she had the intention of trying to alleviate the suffering of the children there. So there was always this silence in my parents' house and a prohibition on talking. I describe in the book how when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I was rummaging around my mother's dresser and found a photograph of a little girl, and I asked who it was. My mother became very angry on behalf of my father because I say this in the book, there was more than once that she inserted himself between him and his memories. She wanted to help him not remember, so she ordered me to never ask about Rita. And that's when I fell silent, essentially. And so the ways that I found to express feelings about that whole situation were very indirect. I wrote poems in French because my parents didn't understand French. And
you didn't want them. I mean, you didn't want them to read
I was afraid. I was afraid. I was afraid to let them see what I had written. And in fact, it wasn't until very late that they even the poem that I wrote about Rita was actually published in a journal. I think it was the University of a poetry journal at University of Kansas or some such place. And so when I heard that it had been accepted for publication, I was, of course, very excited. And I would normally have called my parents and told them. But then I had a real dilemma because the poem was about Rita. And they didn't know that even was thinking about her, and I was afraid it would cause them more grief.
But at one point, then your father, a very dramatic anecdote in the book, gave you
Gave me the
the
picture.
only photograph that.
Yeah,
picture.
because when the poem was published, and I was probably about 25, 26, I was in graduate school. When the poem was published, I called them and I got up the courage to tell them about it. We spoke on the phone every Sunday. And I said I had a poem published, and they said, oh, send it to us. And I said, well, it's in French. And they said, send it. And it's amazing what comes up. And I said, well, but it's about Rita. And they said, send it. My mother said, send it. And they had a Hungarian friend who spoke French and translated. They never said a word to me about it. And until I was probably in my mid-30s, and I was down visiting San Diego, and just as I was leaving, my father came into the kitchen and said, that poem you wrote. I said, yes. He said, you talked about your sister. I said, yes. I didn't know what was coming. And he said, do you want a picture of her?
What was your reaction to that?
I said, yes. And just as today, 35 years later, my throat closed up and I couldn't speak.
Yeah.
So it's this theme of not being able to speak.
And of course, the pictures used in your art, you talk about your art sharing the fragments of my own past and a combination of images and words. Where does the title come from? Chocolates from Tangier. What does that mean?
People need to read it, but I will tell you. When my mother was in Terezin for a time, and I don't remember if it extended through the whole two plus years that they were there, they were allowed to receive packages, like care packages. And my mother would sign, they had to sign for them. And they always, even though most of the time when a package came, the Germans would steal everything out of the package, but then the prisoners still had to sign a postcard to go back to the person acknowledging that it was received. So at one point, my mother had received a package that the return address was Tangier in Morocco. And she didn't know anyone in Tangier, so she was confused. And the package contained chocolates, which was, of course, as valuable a commodity as cigarettes. You could trade chocolates for food, for medicine, and so forth. And it wasn't until 50 years after the war that when my mother came to live with me, and we were going down to, when she first was here, it was a very frantic, very upsetting time, and she wasn't in good shape. And I gave her this book to read that I had found called The Mezuzah in the Madonna's Foot. And it was by a woman named Trudy Alexi, who likewise had come from Prague. She's a bit older than well, certainly older than me, because she was already a child before the war. But long story short, in her book, she talks about the fact that there was this wealthy Jewish refugee who had gone from Hungary to Tangier with her husband. And because they were well off relatively, she started sending packages back to prisoners in the ghettos and the concentration camps in Europe. And in fact, sent chocolates. So we deduced, we were standing in a frame shop in Santa Barbara in the year 1995. And my mother said, I have to tell you something about that book. And she told me this story. So that's the sort of the theme of it, the symbolism of it. I go over and over it in my mind. It's like things are explained, at moments when you least expect them to be explained. And this, I don't know about you, but this happens more and more now that I'm older. These things keep popping up from the past.
Yeah.
So that's the
One of
story
the
of the chocolates.
one of the themes and one of the ideas that you wrestle with in a book is whether you even had the right to make art about this. You know, you write that at one point you felt guilty and ashamed for appropriating the content
Mhm.
because it treads upon the sacred memory of the Shoah. How did you resolve that?
Think I have changed my views somewhat over the years. At the time that I initially wrote that, which was in connection with the exhibit in Prague in 2006, I was really determined to be something of a documentarian in the art, to make a mark on behalf of all of these people that had died. And so I was very attuned to sticking to facts and being very accurate in the depictions. And I found that there were artists out there who had appropriated the Holocaust in ways that made me very uncomfortable. So I wanted to be very careful about that. But as the years have gone on, I've sort of I've accepted that I have a legitimate voice here, you know, as a second generation. I used to be very precise about who got to call themselves a survivor. You know, I had a good friend here whose parents came to New York as refugees in 1938, and he called himself a survivor, and I was somewhat offended by that. Now I've broadened my scope of empathy for people who have been affected by this, primarily because we're learning, you know, even through the study of epigenetics, that people like me actually carry the trauma in ourselves. Um, I've been reading Marion Hirsch, who is a professor at NYU, who writes about this concept of post-memory and the process of these traumatic events coming in to the second and third generation. And this is really important, I think, to understand in a lot of areas of controversy and conflict, because I read a book a couple of years ago called My Grandmother's Hands. And this book was by an African-American social worker in Minneapolis. The book was written, I think, just after the George Floyd murder. And he talks about the traumatic experience of slavery coming through the generations, you know, to present day African Americans. And he also talks about the police body and that trauma in whatever that background was. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that these are real things, that people are not appropriating somebody else's story, that this has helped me really to embrace, I don't know if that's the right word, but to understand that, yes, this is my story to tell from my perspective.
Yeah. And one of the remarkable things is, you know, how far afield, I guess, you're gathering materials for the assemblages, for your collages, you know, from different decades, from different periods, from different people, from different trips. And one of the first things that you that you completed that was exhibited was for a project called Women Beyond Borders.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I don't know if it's an assemblage or a collage, I don't know the difference, but there was a scroll in there which contained a piece of automatic writing that you had
Mm-hmm.
done
Mm-hmm.
earlier,
Yeah.
1971, I think. And you thought the words, the content of the scroll would not be visible because it was very private. And I'll just read the beginning. my sister died before I was a little girl. She was put in a gas chamber in a concentration camp, and it really builds after that. And you were somewhat surprised that the words themselves were included in the exhibition. Why did you want to not show that, and how did you feel when it was shown?
As you said, that was some automatic writing with my non-dominant hand that I had done in the mid-70s when I was in law school, actually. And the reason I did it was because I had been told that if you try to write with your non-dominant hand, stuff comes up, childhood memories, emotions, things that stay under wraps. And so I did that. And I then typed it up, and I created this little scroll, which I attached to the box. And I didn't want people to see it. I don't really know how to explain it. I thought people would misunderstand it, that they would, criticize it, make fun of it. I don't know. It didn't feel safe to let people know.
So you kind of snuck it into the piece.
I snuck it in there, just as, if you look at the image of that box, inside the box, the picture of the little girl on top of the box is me at about age 4. But inside the box, which I hid and I bound in black ribbon, was a picture of my father and Rita. And I was hiding them too. I was feeling like, I think I was still feeling that I didn't have the right to expose their story or to expose my father's grief, because I had been told over and over again, never talk about it. So I think that's why. And then, of course, the darling woman who organized Women Beyond Borders is Lorraine Serena, who's a Santa Barbarian. If you know, her husband Frank was a developer in Santa Barbara for many years, and Lorraine, unbeknownst to me, printed that entire thing in the catalog for the exhibit. So it's all over the world now. It's okay now. It wasn't okay then, but
how did you, was that a great relief? Was it an embarrassment? I mean,
I felt embarrassed. I felt embarrassed because I didn't know whether people would understand how and why that came into being, because it is written in a child's voice. Mm-hmm. And it discloses an awful lot about how I felt as a child. So I wasn't ready to have that be out there, but it is, so too late.
Yeah, another theme, we got about 5 minutes left, but another theme is you relating to your Jewishness. What does that mean for you? And you said it was difficult to fix an identity or even a geographical location for myself as a Jew in the world. This and the fact that I do not fully belong anywhere as the only daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, refugees from communism and immigrant twice over myself. And then you have a piece called, I don't know if that's the title, that includes the words "a land with no people" for a people with no land. Mm-hmm. You're struggling with that question. Have you resolved that? What is that? What is the importance and the meaning of that for you?
So that the answer is no, I haven't resolved that. And that quote pertains specifically to Israel. And I would like to say, I often say that I'm a child of a mixed marriage, both Jews, both Holocaust survivors. But my father was an atheist and an anti-Zionist, and my mother was mystical, spiritual, and a Zionist in her youth, and had even wanted to go to Israel as a young woman, as a pioneer. So it's always been a source of conflict. That particular title and that particular piece, I think the alternative title of that piece is Big Jew, because it depicts it depicts a boy in a talit who's much bigger than the olive trees around him. And for me, the olive trees represent Palestine for both Jews and Palestinians. And the quote is actually a quote that has been misattributed to Golda Meir. The quote, I've been informed just on Saturday, is a quote from early Zionists. And the full quote was, a land with no people for a people with no land. So this was, and Palestine was portrayed as an empty desert that the Jews had gone and made bloom. So that's a very fraught political dilemma.
Yeah. Well, and you also write considerably about how your own life has been affected by anti-Semitism, whether it's not getting into a sorority or any number of other things.
Small offenses in the grand scheme,
but
still painful.
I was struck by this. You say, what is most painful to me at this late stage of my life, for my own sake as well as for my Jewish grandchildren, however much they see their Jewishness as a choice, is that just as overt acts of Jew hatred have multiplied around the world, Jews have been increasingly isolated, excluded, as unworthy of partnership in the common struggle for a more just and equitable world. Jews are being systematically shunned by advocates of intersectionality. What does that? Elaborate on that. Explain that a little bit.
Well, I go back to, the days of my idealistic youth when African Americans and Jews were allies in the civil rights movement. Two of the three civil rights activists who were killed in Mississippi in 1964, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, two of the three were Jews, the other was Black. I was brought up with, the thing I have to credit my parents for, and especially my mother, I was brought up with a lot of empathy for other groups, ethnic groups that had suffered and were suffering discrimination. So over the years, as there's been more and more of a separation, and as Jews have been considered by other marginalized groups as being more a part of the power structure than not, that's been painful to me and heartbreaking. And I don't know how to bridge that gap, but I really feel that going forward, our only hope is to reform and form alliances again. And I hope that, in a way, I hope that reading this book helps people to break through their biases and stop reacting to the other, and to be able to embrace again a common interest and a common need to overcome this kind of stuff.
Well, of course, many progressives embrace critical theory, whether it's race or gender or sexuality, whatever, where you have an oppressor, an oppressor, and the oppressed, and then you have different categories of each. And one of the things that most amazed me in the last couple of years is, as the state of California made ethnic studies a requirement in public schools and began to put together the curriculum for that, anti-Semitism was not in the original curriculum. I mean, there was a whole battle to do that. And it's strange to me that would be kind of left out of the story of bias and discrimination and so on, particularly because, right here in Santa Barbara a couple of weeks ago, what did we see? These anti-Semitic leaflets distributed house to house. When you talk about hatred of Jews surfacing more, what are you thinking of?
You mean as it comes out more?
Yes.
Well, yeah, these recent events here for sure, but all shootings in synagogues, there was an article yesterday about the survivors of a shooting at a synagogue a year ago in Fort Worth, and talking about how they're still traumatized from that. So it's serious and it's real. We haven't seen the dramatic version of it here yet, and I hope we don't, but there's a lot of really hard feelings out there and a lot of anger. So it wouldn't surprise me.
But things that we thought had been litigated and were in the past. I mean, certainly.
Yeah. Well, Holocaust denial being one of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you know that very early in my legal career, I actually was involved in a case called Mermelstein versus the Institute of Historical Review, where I helped to represent an Auschwitz survivor who had gotten into a dispute with the Holocaust denial group, which had baited him to prove that the Holocaust happened. And this was 40 years ago. And it's only gotten, I think it kind of receded for a couple of decades, but with the internet and the dark web and all these opportunities for really insane ideas to take root, it's gotten really, really frightening again.
Yeah. Well, we're living in frightening times and
yeah,
confusing times. And, you know, I think your book is really very, very powerful. And oops, I don't know.
Thank you.
Can't hold that right.
What's up with your
Anyway, 6 p.m. Thursday, Jana will be at Chaucer. She'll be talking about the book, signing books. And I guess what you're going to make a presentation about some of your art as well.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a struggle to deal with the practical aspects. I have to be able to show the art to talk about it. And the best option I've come up with is to have people look at it on their phones. I have an incipient website, and if you get on the website, now of course Chaucer's doesn't have Wi-Fi, so this could be a great disappointment. But I'm hoping that people will be able to get it on their phones. And I'm also hoping, I also have designed my talk so that I say, if you look at page 121 in the book that you just purchased, that image is there. So I hope people pick up their books ahead of time as well.
All right. Jana Zimmer, thank you so much for spending some time with us. The book is Chocolates from Tangier, a Holocaust replacement child's memoir of art and transformation. Chaucer's on Thursday night. Thanks again, Jana.
Thank you, Jerry.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.